Peter Murrell, otherwise known as Mr. Nicholas Sturgeon, is an innocent man. He is innocent until proven guilty. That is an absolute bulwark of our legal system, and it will not be broken here on the show this evening. So if you manage to get your telephone call onto the show, please make sure that you are not in breach of the 1981 Contempt of Court Act in Scotland, which provides condign punishment for those acting in contempt of court on a matter which is, or at least was until half an hour ago, sub judice. It is not sub judice now because Peter Murrell has been released without charge, and therefore we are a little bit freer than we would have been if he had been charged, but we are still not free. The interests of natural justice make clear that we must be careful what we say, especially on any presumption of guilt. But this much we know, that Nicola Sturgeon did not know the police were about to arrest her husband, Peter Murrell. It was entirely coincidental that she left the house at 8:10 this morning and the police arrived at 8:30. It was a close call. She might even have bumped into them as she drove out of the cul-de-sac. Neither is it true that the police delayed this arrest this morning until the continuity candidate of Sturgeon and Murrell was safely ensconced as the Chief Minister, First Minister of Scotland. That too was a coincidence. And some people are alleging otherwise, but I would not. Although I do have a bridge here in London that I could sell you going cheap. The facts are that the police were just slow off the mark with their arrest. Hamza Yusuf just got in just in time, just like Nicola Sturgeon got out of the house this morning just in time. I've got a bone to pick with the Police Scotland. I might as well get it off my chest right now. You will recall that now months ago, this show was threatened in a bomb attack. And the threatener said that if the bomb failed to work, he would knife me with a sword. He very helpfully put his name at the bottom of the threat. More than that, he even more helpfully put his address at the top of the threat. Even more helpful than that, he affixed a copy of his photograph next to his address and his name on the bomb and knife threat that he sent to the mother of all talk shows. Police Scotland took up the matter because that was where my residence was. They spent a lot of time taking statements about where everyone was when this threat arrived. And since then, we have heard absolutely nothing. Despite the man giving his name, address, and photograph, he has not been arrested. You might well wonder if another politician who was threatened by this man or any other man giving so much of themselves away would have been arrested. Maybe Police Scotland are just very slow to make arrests. They've been slower in the Murrell case because they've been investigating £600,000 of missing SNP funds for well over a year. And it's not the only investigation that the Police Scotland force are involved in. All kinds of investigations into the governing party's inner workings and their relationship with outer organizations have been ongoing, again in this case, for more than a year. I hope that under Hamza Yusuf, Police Scotland will get the resources they quite evidently need to do a more efficient job. And then that the courts will back them up. Scotland is in uproar at the community service picking up litter given to a 21-year-old man for raping a 13-year-old girl in a park. The reasoning, the judge says, was that the SNP's law required judges to be lenient with defendants under the age of 25 because the law says a man's brain is not fully formed until he's 25, which makes it all the more strange that the same SNP reduced the voting age from 18 to 16 and are trying to reduce it to 14. So you get to pick up litter. As J.K. Rowling said today, your first rape is for free in Scotland if you're under 25. What happens to people who self-identify as under 25 is not yet clear. All of the foregoing will have alerted the most perspicacious viewers that I really don't like the Scottish Nationalist Party. But then at least 45% of their own members don't like them either. And grandees like Jim Sillars, their former deputy leader, like them even less than me. So, as we say in Scotland, their tea is out. They're in for the mother of all thrashings when the parliamentary by-election in central Scotland takes place in the summer of this year. And when every successive electoral contest takes place, I believe the Scottish people will be telling them how much they dislike them also. But of course, much, much bigger news unfolded in the farce in Manhattan earlier this week. The decision by DA Bragg, and he certainly did lots of bragging about it, to charge the last president of the United States of America for paying hush money to a slattern in the name of Stormy Daniels was itself a bold, even reckless move. But dazzling some of the best legal brains in America, one of whom we've got coming up as a guest in the second hour, dazzling some of the best American legal brains, the reason Bragg gave in the court for reheating this cold case that the federal authorities had already considered and dismissed was that Trump had done this in order to cover up a felony that he would otherwise have had exposed. Except Bragg was unable to name the felony, and therefore Donald Trump was required to plead guilty or not guilty. As it happened, he pled not guilty to a crime which was supposed to have been a cover-up of another crime which the state of New York is either unable or unwilling to identify. In any normal courtroom, that would have been cause for the striking out of the grand jury indictment that Trump was facing. But this was no normal court. Liberals are up in arms because Trump identified that the daughter of the judge had previously worked for Vice President Kamala Harris and President Joe Biden, the very man that Donald Trump is going to fight in the 2024 presidential election. Now, I can think of no fact more relevant than that the judge in the case would appear to have a daughter who is an activist, a super activist in the opposing party. Liberals are also up in arms that the Trump camp has had the temerity to point out that the district attorney himself was paid for in his election campaign by George Soros, Trump's biggest opponent on the earth, and there are a lot of competitors for that title. What could be more relevant than the fact that the district attorney's election expenses and all of his costs in running to be the DA in New York were paid for by the high priest, the guru, the Dalai Lama of liberalism and globalism in the form of Mr. George Soros. I saw the proceedings unfold. They were unseemly. At least half of America will consider them unseemly, and even some of the other half must have been shifting somewhat uneasily. Bill Clinton, for one, in the Democratic camp, must have been wondering that if it's a crime to pay hush money to slatterns, then he might very well be the next guy in trouble. If it's a crime to have flown on Jeffrey Epstein's jet, if it's a crime to have, well, let me just put it this way, danced with some of Jeffrey Epstein's nubile young maidens, I'm sure he did no more than that, then perhaps Bill Clinton will be next in line. Maybe Hunter Biden, who didn't just pay hush money to slatterns, he paid hush money to crack cocaine suppliers. He paid hush money to the big guy, whoever that big guy may be. He paid 10% to the big guy on money that came from all over the world, but mainly from the Ukraine. You're beginning to get a picture here about how perverse all of these proceedings have turned out to be. The question we're asking in our poll tonight is whether all of this will make it more or less likely that Trump will defeat Joe Biden when 2024 comes along, presuming God spares both of them. I myself am leaning to the view that Joe Biden and the Democrats will come to rue the day that they began this prosecution of Donald J. Trump, and that it will backfire, and that it may backfire in another way. That if and when Trump gets back in the White House and with control of at least the House of Representatives, if not both houses of Congress, then a terrible vengeance will be wreaked by Donald Trump on his persecutors. Not that I know. For all I know, Bragg may have something really big up his sleeve, but yesterday was the day to produce it, and he singularly failed to produce it. Who Framed Roger Rabbit might be another name for this show this evening. Cold Cases Reheated may be a second name. But I want to turn to little Macron, little Napoleon, who, according to Bloomberg, flew to Beijing to warn China that if they got any closer to Russia, then serious consequences would ensue. I haven't yet looked at the comparison between the economic strength of China and the economic strength of France. I do know that France is on fire, with literally millions of its citizens on the streets every day being clubbed and gassed and smoke bombed by the thugs of President Macron, sometimes called the French police. And in parenthesis, I wonder just what goes through the mind of these Western leaders, whose own country is in a state of pre-revolutionary upheaval. He is in China warning the Chinese government about a foreign war which ought to have nothing at all to do with him. But I did find some interesting statistics. Did you know that the city of Shanghai alone has a bigger GDP than the state of the Netherlands? No harm to the Netherlands. My own wife comes from there. But that's how puny the Netherlands economy is compared to China's. Finland, which is in the news this week, as the latest addition to NATO, has a GDP smaller than the city of Wuhan in China, which prior to the COVID outbreak, I had never even heard of. If you want to compare G7 economies, with one exception, you need to compare them with cities in China, not with China itself. The idea that these fleas are flying to China, an elephant, and biting its rear end and expecting to be noticed, expecting to be kowtowed to, is perfectly absurd. And yet that is what Macron and von der Leyen are doing. I wondered why von der Leyen was going. Now I know she's the bookies' red-hot favourite to be the next General Secretary of NATO, because the Norwegian tailor's dummy, Stoltenberg, is stepping back from the post, having done everything that he could to drag us all into World War III. Von der Leyen, whose diplomatic skills are, how shall I put it, less than sharply honed, such that the German party of which she is a member sent her to the European Union to get her out of German politics. The European Union is now sending her to NATO to get her out of European politics. But von der Leyen and Macron are there in China to threaten, warn, or is it charm? Who knows? As I said earlier, the Chinese are impervious to charm, in my experience. Inscrutable is indeed the right word for them. And they react even more badly to threats. So for Europe's sake, and I am, of course, a European, for Europe's sake, I really hope that Macron behaves better in China than he has recently been behaving in France. I want to turn finally to the terrorist attack that took place in a cafe in St Petersburg. I dealt with it when it had just happened on the show last Sunday, if you want to look back. By the way, in the last 7 days, 1.24 million people watched all or part of the mother of all talk shows. And that's before we start MOATS auf Deutsch. That's before we start MOATS America, and one or two others that I have got up my sleeve. But I wanted to deal with the scarcely concealed glee, the scarcely concealed round of applause which Western media gave to a bomb explosion which decapitated a journalist and seriously wounded up to 40 other people whose only crime was they were sitting in a cafe with the target of the bomb. Bellingcat, the pet of the Western establishment, governments, liberal newspapers, openly stated that the attack on Tatarsky was justifiable because he was not a journalist, but a propagandist. We must hope that that idea does not catch on, because I know quite a lot of journalists on the other side of this argument who could very easily be labeled as a propagandist rather than a journalist. And I don't know, I'm only guessing. It could be that Russia is able to do these kind of things at least as well, maybe better, than the people who blew the head of Tartarsky. This ambivalent attitude to terrorism, which we see all the time, from Charlie Hebdo to London Bridge, from the head-chopping, throat-cutting of the Islamist terrorists, ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, and our attitude to them in German Christmas markets, or on the streets of Paris or of Brussels. This double standard about terrorism is another sign of the advanced decay of Western civilization. It is no surprise that people are turning away from us in droves. President Lula of Brazil is also in China. Macron, von der Leyen are in China. The Prime Minister of Spain is in China. There's a meeting tomorrow to solidify the peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We are not in Camp David or on the White House lawn, but in China. There's a meeting tomorrow brokering peace between Syria and Turkey. Where? In Moscow, in Russia. The Prime Minister of Malaysia made an agreement with the Chinese president just yesterday to set up an AMF, not an IMF, but an AMF, an Asian Monetary Fund. The queue of people trying to join the BRICS, the queue of people trying to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization grows longer almost by the week. People are fleeing from us. They're fleeing away from us because of the degeneracy in our societies. Don't get me started adumbrating all the signs of that degeneracy, but one of them is that we'll applaud terrorism as long as it's blowing the head off somebody we disagree with. But if someone comes and blows our heads off, then they are indeed the Antichrist, who must be hunted down. The countries from which they come must be sanctioned and may be invaded and occupied if necessary. This degeneracy that I have been speaking about now for 3 years has reached a critical stage. A critical mass has now been achieved in the stampede away from us and towards the east. I've gone on too long because I couldn't see the clock. Please forgive me. Keep your seatbelts fastened. It's going to be a bumpy night. It's the mother of all talk shows.